Um, I recently spoke about my thoughts on Westerners who kowtow to authoritarian regimes, and the two that I have in mind really is the regimes in Beijing and Moscow. I mention those more than others because they're powerful, because they're significant in a way that say, I mean, there are a few Westerners, for example, that will praise North Korea. But North Korea is not on the same level of geopolitical importance as China or Russia, so they're almost more a laughingstock. With those who serve as propagandists for Russia and China, they're more significant because they can actually be used. And those are powerful regimes. There's no escaping it. Both China and Russia are powerful countries led by powerful regimes. Um, so I want to be a bit specific here because this relates to my own interests, namely in freelance journalism. Now, just a little bit of explanation here. Freelance journalism is basically you submit reports, you do the sort of normal work of a field journalist. It could be a field journalist, it could be, well, actually, if field journalism is required for freelancing, you actually do need to work a bit harder because you can't just sit in a comfy office and just write stuff from what you find on the internet. Um, but the difference is you're not working as a staff reporter. You're not working full time for a particular newspaper or publication or outlet. And it's something I would aspire to do. I'm not going to be braggadocious. I don't know how good I'll be. It's something that I really want to work hard at. I'm working on this course, but it does mean that you look at media outlets from a certain perspective, and you look at newspapers and you look at how things are delivered. Now, without question, you'll get all sorts of scopes of political ideology within Western newspapers, like within the UK newspapers. You'll have right wing platforms, you'll have left wing platforms. There's some papers I've no time for, and I would be extremely reluctant to work for. One thing I will never do, and may these words come back to haunt me if I do, is sell my soul to a hostile foreign state. That's just something I could not do. Not just for any sort of patriotic sentiments, although that's part of it, but also um, because I believe the day I do that, I will have no moral credibility. And I think a good journalist needs to have certainly public trust. Very hard these days, but at least some degree of moral credibility. It's not to say you need to be a saint, but at least have some degree of moral credibility. Now, what's been noticeable in recent years, because really we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, the sort of armed conflicts that have been taking place in the world, especially when they involve the great powers, have very much become media conflicts in the sense it's battle of views, a battle of political ideologies, more so than ever before. I mean, through the scope of news media. There's always been propaganda in war, that's always existed, but more so than ever have we seen how certain networks are utilized specifically to defend or attack warring parties. Now, I know where I stand. I will always stand on the side of democracy and human rights. That is not to say, that is not to say that I have this dewy-eyed notion that, oh, democracy could just happen overnight. But I have to say I find it rather repugnant when I see so-called independent journalists, some of them are quite famous, basically selling their souls to defend authoritarian regimes. I find it utterly repugnant because it's a position of power. Actually, they've got a position of power and they're abusing that power. So I'll give an example. Jon Pilger, UK-based Australian journalist. He's quite old now. He's 80 years old now, but he's fairly famous. Um, and for most of his career, he's been quite respected. He's always been to the left. No secret about that. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. But Jon Pilger is a good example to use because Pilger had long been seen as kind of the personification of a good, brave, thorough, investigative freelance journalist. You know, he worked extensively. He was unquestionably quite brave at points with his field work. But it's become obvious that Pilger has allowed his political ideology, namely his critique of Western foreign policy, cloud his judgment as a journalist. Now, I agree that journalists are, it's a bit naive to think they could be absolutely neutral in reporting. I don't know if that's possible. But I do think that journalists have to be careful not to allow their political ideology to cloud their judgment. And Pilger is an example of this happening because he's such a critic of Western foreign policy, which he has described as neo-colonialist and imperialistic. It's not just that he criticises Western foreign policy. Pilger has now went further. Well, not right now. This is sort of within the last decade. He has basically become a propagandist for the Putin regime. If you want evidence of this, Pilger contributes to Russia Today. I don't know if he's a full on paid up member of Russia Today, as in a staff member, but he has extensively contributed to it. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that tells me everything I need to know about where Jon Pilger's moral compass lies at the moment. In other words, he goes to RT because RT suits his political ideology. And you might say this is true of most journalists, but RT is exceptional, really, in the brazen way it promotes its propaganda. In the brazen way it puts out conspiracy theories as facts. In the brazen way it promotes Russian ultranationalism, never ever questions Putin or Moscow, never. And yet its coverage of the West is entirely negative, entirely. His latest ramblings was about the British government's failure on COVID-19. My response to that is, okay, journalists can ask those questions. I wouldn't say Pilch doesn't have a right to ask the questions. What I do say is that by tying himself to the Putin regime, by working for RT, he has no moral credibility. And I'm well aware of scope here. I'm well aware of how people perceive this. You know, who am I? People might say, oh, how dare you question the great Jon Pilger? He's a lot more experience than I have. Yeah, he does. I freely admit that. But that doesn't mean someone cannot sell their soul. Doesn't mean that someone cannot go from being a respectable person who is seeking the truth to being a sellout. And as far as I'm concerned, Pilger has become a sellout. I mean, I'm not saying I was ever a massive fan of his, but I do see a change. I do see that this is a man who was once a left-wing journalist who, you know, would do investigative reports on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But I think that to go to another level, to work for RT, I have no respect for anyone who works for RT. I say the same about British politicians who go and they claim they're not selling themselves out. But they need to understand that whatever they think, and I'm not saying this is the case with Pilger, I think he knows what he's doing. But you know, people who go and they say, oh, it's just a one off, and I've criticized Putin in the past. The point is, RT is part of the Russian state. It's absolutely a propaganda tool used by the Russian state. I cannot believe that even now people cannot see it for what it is. But then again, the sort of people who endorse RT, you just have to look at the comments. You know, there's no sort of objective thinking whatsoever. None. People who endorse RT, they go to RT because it kind of fuels their anti-West ideology. I mean, look at the comments on RT. One thing that's very noticeable is the utter lack of free thinking. So for people who claim that they're against mainstream media, what are they doing? They are endorsing a state mouthpiece and they're not thinking for themselves. They think they're so enlightened and so open minded. And you notice I haven't defended Western media here. I'm not saying, oh, well, they should watch the BBC instead. They should watch CNN instead. No, I don't say that. I can think of many reasons to criticize those networks. I just think it's utterly repugnant. Someone like Pilger uses his fame to work for a regime like that. To work for a regime that has a very long track record of silencing opponents. I mean, look at Russia's track record on press freedom. That's why I find it so utterly galling that RT and their stooges have the audacity to ask about transparency in the West when they never ever report on transparency in Russia. And I've actually vowed to myself that next time I'm in London, if I see some live reporting going on with RT, and I'm going to say this right now, I won't attack anyone. I'm not going to be physical, but I think I would like to remonstrate with the next RT reporter I see. I might ask them, how can you sleep at night? You know, working for the Putin regime. See what they have to say. I might get arrested for some sort of public nuisance. I don't know. I honestly think Ofcom has shown itself to be utterly gutless. Ofcom hasn't done a thing. So it may well come down to concerned individuals. I'm not going to be reckless. I'm not going to go up and assault someone, but I am going to challenge them. Honestly, next time I'm in London, if that happens, if that's so, I'm not going to say I'm going to go out of my way to find an RT reporter. But you know, these people can freely report in our capital. They can promote anti-Western conspiracy theories and pro-Russian lies. So yeah, they need to be challenged. This is the problem. They haven't really been held to account. I mean, Ofcom has given them big warnings. Ofcom has shown itself to be utterly useless. Even though Ofcom has the power to do it, they won't. And I don't know why. Maybe they've been intimidated behind the scenes. I don't know what it is. But Ofcom has the power to take action against the likes of RT and CGTN, and they won't. It's frankly incredibly infuriating. Now, another example, and she's not as famous as Jon Pilger, but she did get a fair amount of attention a few years ago, is the Canadian national Eva Bartlett. Again, you know, she's a stooge of RT, but she's been held up as an independent journalist. Really? This is a woman who shamelessly has promoted the Assad regime in Syria, even even as he was raining barrel bombs on the children. And I think one reason the Assad regime has got the upper hand in the war, there's a lot of reasons for it, but I think one reason is that he has the backing of the power of Russia's octopus of propaganda. And it's despicable. And you get stooges like Eva Bartlett who calls herself independent. But you know, to those who support her, simple question. Let's see if you can answer it. How can she be independent when she enthusiastically backs one side over another? If you think that's independent, you are just you're brainwashed. You are ignorant in the extreme. And what gets me is the supporters of these people will just churn out this nonsense without even stopping to reflect on themselves. They're so incredibly ignorant that they would actually argue that supporting a murderous dictator like Assad somehow equates to independent journalism. I have to say it makes my stomach turn. I mean, Eva Bartlett shamelessly lied about the white helmets, even though her claims have been debunked. She, for example, said that the white helmets and their backers were actually terrorists. And the supposed proof of this was that she took pictures from different bomb sites, and she claimed that the same little girl was in both pictures. In other words, so how could the same girl be at both sites? Closer scrutiny actually found that whilst the little girl looked similar in both pictures, she was actually a different child. Looked similar. There was some physical resemblances, as sometimes happens, but she was actually a different child. This reminds me of American gun nuts who come out with their crisis actors theory when there's a mass shooting. Now, some people might say I'm biased towards the West, but if that was the case, I would be just blindly believing everything the BBC and CNN and other outlets say, and I would not be critical of them. You see, the difference between me and RT sheep, and I'm afraid I don't have any respect for them, is that I do think for myself. I really do. They don't. They believe everything RT tells them, and they look up to the likes of Pilger and Bartlett, thinking that they're actually have some sort of moral credibility. I think Pilger gets hailed because he does have extensive experience. I mean, he's been doing this for decades, but doesn't mean he can't sell his soul. It doesn't mean that that suddenly gives him moral credibility when he is actively working for a regime that has a track record of silencing dissent. I mean, like I say, just look at the record of press freedom in Russia. And finally, what really, really infuriates me, forget the journalism thing, what infuriates me as a human being is they get away with it. They get away with it. You see, my issue with Pilger is not that it's critical of the West, it's that he is serving as a yes man for Putin. It's disgusting. And when his obituary is written, like I say, he's in his 80s now, when his obituary is written so many years from now, I hope to goodness it writes that he sold himself out. I hope to goodness it covers that fact. Finally, on a more optimistic note, a more positive note, in a sense, contrast these people with someone like Gareth Jones. You may or may not know the name. Gareth Jones was a young Welsh reporter who, in the 1930s, took significant personal risk to expose the Holodomor in Ukraine. Independently, he verified it. He was the first Western reporter to do so. He's now the subject of a biographic film. And by the way, I haven't seen the film. So, you can't say, oh, you're clouded by sentiment of a film. This guy, in his 20s, went to the then Soviet controlled Ukraine and reported this and its true horrors. He ended up dead, most likely riddled by NKVD bullets, whilst reporting from Manchuria. Now, he is an example of an actual brave journalist, or an actual, I'll rephrase that, because I think someone could be brave but still sell their soul, as Pilger has. Um, it's not me to question Pilger's bravery, but I can question his integrity because the evidence is there. But someone like Gareth Jones, who actually risks his life to expose tyranny, versus someone who widely respected and sold himself out to tyranny. It's a real contrast there.